Hi everyone, this is Catherine Vera, and today I will be presenting on an article titled Forecasting China's Economic Growth by 2020 and 2030, written by Xiaolu Wang and Yi Xiaozhou. This article, written in 2015, attempts to do the following 6 things: identify key economic drivers, identify key reasons for the slow growth rate, break down the supply side factors, and break down the demand side factors, build growth models to quantitatively analyze factor inputs and total factor productivity, and delineate 3 scenario forecasts for China's economic future towards becoming a high-income country. But before getting into all of that, it's important to understand some of the background history with all of this. So, from the 1970s to the early 2000s, China has enjoyed a yearly growth rate of about 9.9% economically. However, in 2015, when this article was written, that growth rate slowed to about 6.9%. And it's for this reason this article attempts to answer the following questions. On the second slide, I list essential key terms for understanding this article, the most important of which is TFP, total factor productivity, and I define it here. During those 3 decades between 1970 and the early 2000s, there were many reasons for China's rapid economic growth, 5 of which stand out in this article. They are China's transition to the market economy resulted in an increase of resource allocation and an increase of economic efficiency. The rapid capital accumulation driven by high savings, which ended up fueling economic growth as well. The openness to trade and investment coupled with an advantage in labor-intensive industries. Number 4 was China quickly industrializing and urbanizing meant that the changes in economic structure enhanced allocative efficiency and increased demand overall. And 5, the 5th reason why the economy increased was there was a demographic boom in the labor force from the 1980s and 90s that arrived simultaneously as the demographic boom in developed countries at the same time. But, this article argues, this pattern has run its course. The following slide is a reason as to why China's growth is slowing, and there are 4 different reasons. The first is that savings and investment rates began to rise, leading to overcapacity that lowers the productivity of capital overall. The second is that there was too much government interference in resource allocation, which essentially meant rampant corruption coupled with government expansion. The third reason was that there was no stable macroeconomic environment or prudent economic policies due to the global financial crisis that happened in 2008. And the policies that the People's Bank of China, acronymed here as PBC, with their monetary easing measures that only ended up hurting the economy. Number 4 was that there was no more demand for China's exports, which meant that China had to lean heavily on their domestic consumption. That, coupled with an aging population no longer in the labor workforce, really hurt their economy. On slide 6, Wang and Zhou built a growth model amended from one in 1988, referenced here as Lucas. In this model, they incorporate human capital, physical capital, urbanization rate, non-state or private shares in the economy, foreign shares in capital stock, technological progresses, market-oriented reform, government administrative costs, consumption rates, and leverage ratios, all within the time series data from 1950s to 2014. In the table I show you in the next slide, 4.1, Wang and Zhou carry out a growth accounting exercise to calculate factor contributions and impact of institutional and structural elements on GDP growth. Total factor contribution here in this element is the sum of contributions from all remaining variables. Table 4.2, on the other hand, contains a decomposition of TFP. Now, the main findings of growth accounting essentially are, number one, that capital is the biggest role in driving growth, but productivity overall has dropped. Specifically, they say capital elasticity dropped from 0.5 to 0.39, and the sum of output capital elasticity and human capital is significantly below 1. Sorry about that. Indicating the economy has changed from constant returns to scale to increased returns to scale. The fall is due to overcapacity, indicating overinvestment has weakened contributions of capital to economic growth. The second would be contributions of human capital to economic growth decreases significantly over different periods due to slow labor force growth. The third would be the research and development capital that lacked statistical significance in the model was substituted by its first difference term, which was then positive and significant at the 5% level, which implies that research and development capital, when growing at an accelerated rate, had positive impacts on the economic growth. And since that R&D growth capacity proxied for tech progress, it was implied that tech progress was not the main driver of TFP. The next reason would be urbanization would equal an increase in TFP, contributing about 4 percentage points to the GDP growth. The next would be efficiency of non-state sectors ended up being greater than state sectors during reform periods as opposed to pre-reform periods. And that was attributed to market-oriented reforms that improved resource allocation and incentive mechanisms. The next would be productivity about foreign capital is greater than domestic capital, which was also tied to enhanced improvements of resource allocation as well. The next would be reforms during 2010, where the government administrative costs had increased, lowering the TFP by 4% to 0.9% points every year. It showed a low government efficiency, inappropriate government intervention in the market. And next would be, based on the regression results, the contribution of consumption rates to TFP growth and economic growth is shown in figure 4.1, as you can see in the presentation. It implies consumption rates as higher or lower than 66% that will cause losses of efficiency, lowering of economic growth. The demand side effect, on the other hand, has a downward trend of the utilization rate of industrial capacity from 1978 to 2013, and both figures show significant changes during the 2008 GFC. Figure 4.3 particularly shows the savings rate rising by 15 points to 51% in 2010, the investment rate rising from 13% to 47%, the consumption rate dropping from 64 percentage points to 49%, and the rapid fall was identified by the CCRC, the China Credit Rating Company, the International Monetary Fund, and an article by Yuan and Wang, article on statistics and decision making. So the conclusion delineates the things that we've spoken about already on the factors of growth and why it dropped. There are some recommendations on slide 12, particularly easing constraints to avoid the middle income trap, the monetary policy needing to be restored to neutrality, and the fiscal policy that shifts from government investment to improvement of public services, like social security systems, for example. Last but not least, the article gives 3 future trajectories of economic growth to different policy options as delineated below.